When I joined Credacore, we had 6 engineers, 2 product managers, and a tiny war room with a whiteboard that barely erased. Our servers lived in a hybrid environment, some AWS, some old colocation cabinets a previous founder refused to decommission. The chaos was charming back then, useful even. I wasn't hired for charm. They brought me in as principal infrastructure architect, someone to tame the chaos. My name is Ronald Wong. My job was to build something that wouldn't collapse during market spikes or DDoS attacks. Something resilient, something with bones. Over 18 months, I gave them exactly that. The system I designed wasn't flashy. It didn't make pitch decks or hype reels. It was invisible on purpose. I implemented distributed auto-scaling across 3 cloud providers, built-in traffic failover redundancies, and created an incident response workflow so smooth, even interns could escalate with precision. We hit 99.999% uptime during our first full fiscal year. That's about 5 minutes of downtime across the entire calendar. Product called it magic. Finance called it a black box, but a profitable one. No one asked how it worked, just that it did. Then Marlon Riggs arrived. The new CTO came in fast, fresh off a flashy exit from a crypto payments company I'd never heard of. He wore tailored sneakers and asked for a warmer brand of chaos. His words, in his first town hall, he said something that stayed with me. Speed wins. We optimized for ship velocity, not stability theater. I knew what was coming. I'd seen it before. Marlon started calling my system over-engineered. Said it had too many gates, too many controls. It's like trying to launch a rocket to change a tire, he joked once in front of the product leads. I didn't laugh. He initiated a strategic realignment. That's corporate speak for controlled demolition. First, they dissolved my architecture review board. Then they moved incident management to a shared Slack channel. No SRE on-call rotation. No escalation matrix. Just vibes. Next, my responsibilities were distributed across 3 DevOps engineers. All talented, all overwhelmed. I offered to transition things slowly, maybe do a few pair reviews. My manager told me that wouldn't be necessary. We're just evolving, Ron, he said. When the offboarding notice came through, it wasn't a shock. It was a formality. They called it role redundancy, thanked me for my service, and said they were moving toward a flatter engineering culture. I left without fanfare. No goodbye email. Just one final, polite Slack message in the general channel. Thanks for the journey. Take care of the system. But I took one thing with me. Not out of malice. Out of muscle memory. The documentation. See, Credacore never fully migrated the infrastructure wiki when we switched project tools. Most of my architecture notes, postmortems, and escalation trees lived on my local Notion workspace. It wasn't company property. No one asked for it back. They didn't even know what they had. Over 120 pages of system architecture diagrams, multi-cloud routing tables, service health baselines, and runbooks written for when, not if, things went sideways. When I walked away, I told myself I wouldn't look back. I'd been through this cycle enough times to recognize when a place outgrew its scaffolding. It's part of the life cycle. Build, scale, forget, regret. So I started consulting again. Quiet gigs, infrastructure triage, disaster recovery, post-breach cleanup. The kind of work that doesn't make headlines, but keeps companies alive another quarter. I kept my eye off Credacore until 6 months later, when an email came through my personal inbox at 3:14 a.m. Subject line, Urgent Infrastructure Inquiry, Credacore. The sender was unfamiliar, a VP of Ops I'd never met. The body of the email was short, almost embarrassed. Hi Ronald. We're facing a major service disruption related to core infrastructure dependencies. We understand you previously led the design of these systems. Would you be open to a short consult to help us assess the situation? We're under significant pressure. Any help would be appreciated. Best, Jenna. I read it twice, then a third time. The timing, the wording, the humility. It told me everything I needed to know. They'd broken it, or rather, they'd misunderstood it, loosened a few bolts, then acted surprised when the whole machine started rattling. I didn't respond right away, not because I was angry, because I needed to decide who I was going to be in this story. The guy who gloated, or the guy who got things working again? I closed the email and opened my archive folder labeled Krita Core Infrastack version 3.2. I hadn't touched it in 6 months, but the diagram still made sense. The logic was still clean. I had annotated every component like someone would someday need to reverse engineer it under pressure. Looks like that day had come. Before I replied to Jenna, I did one last thing. I logged into an old monitoring dashboard I still had observer rights to. Someone forgot to revoke it. Probably a junior DevOps hire who assumed offboarding was someone else's job. The metrics were worse than I imagined. Latency up 300%. API gateway failures surging. Database read replicas offline. They weren't just having a bad night. They were weeks into a systemic collapse. And I was the only person alive who still knew where the wires went. So I replied, one sentence. We'll think about it. Click. Send. No heat. No spite. Just truth. And consequences. Have you subscribed to our channel yet? Hit that subscribe button and the notification bell so you don't miss any of our videos. 3 months after I left Krita Core, I joined a firm called Perimeter Base. Smaller team, less buzz, no rooftop kombucha taps, or company Slack emojis. But they had something I respected far more: principles. Perimeter Base built risk intelligence systems for high-stakes clients, disaster response teams, central banks, even aerospace contractors. Their motto was blunt: if it breaks, people suffer. Not revenue, not PR, people. That was language I understood. I joined as lead systems integrity officer. My role was part infrastructure, part investigation, stress testing new deployments, anticipating failure chains before they formed. Most of my days were spent running simulations and explaining to bright, fast-moving engineers why speed isn't always a gift. I didn't talk about Krita Core. Didn't need to. The story was writing itself in the news feeds. Just 6 weeks after I left, they launched Krita Lite, a retail investment product promising real-time portfolio rebalancing with zero service lag. The tech press devoured it. The Stripe of retail finance read one headline: How Krita Core's CTO Marlon Riggs tripled development speed. Read another. There he was, Marlon, posing in one of those editorial shots where the subject pretends not to notice the camera. Jacket sleeves rolled up, watch glinting. The article quoted him liberally. The problem with legacy architecture is that it assumes failure. We build for confidence. I remember staring at that sentence for a full minute. Not because it was wrong, because it was naive. Assuming failure isn't pessimism. It's preparedness. It's adult engineering. But speed sells better than caution. And caution doesn't win you magazine covers. So I closed the article, shut my laptop, and focused on my new work: redundancy audits for a Nordic climate data platform. Quiet, unsexy, essential. Then came the message from Lena. She was a systems analyst at Krita Core. We'd worked side by side during the infrastructure hardening phase. Smart, detail-oriented, the kind of engineer who read commit logs like novels. Her text came in after hours. Ronald, not sure if you've been watching, but they've started disabling the throttling governors you set up. Too restrictive, according to leadership. No gradual ramp down. Just pulled them out. Rate limits are gone too. I leaned back in my chair. That wasn't just bold. That was reckless. The throttling governors weren't designed to protect users from the platform. They were built to protect the platform from the users. During high-volume events, like earnings reports or global sell-offs, they'd slow transaction throughput just enough to avoid cache overflow or database read starvation. Kill the governors, and you invite a flood. I replied with 3 words. Hope they document it. She sent a shrug emoji. I could feel the tension, even through the pixels. I didn't press for more. Engineers in the middle of a controlled fire are careful about who sees the smoke. Over the next few weeks, I saw hints of the fallout ripple across technical forums. A freelance DevOps engineer vented, anonymously, about a major fintech client disabling log rollbacks in production. A QA specialist mentioned sleepless nights validating hotfixes with no staging window. They never named Cretacore, but the patterns were familiar. Identical, even. At Perimeter Base, my days were still long, but steady. We had escalation procedures with teeth. Weekly post-mortems with actual follow-through. The kind of shop where you never had to guess one problem. I slept better. But the funny thing about letting go of something you helped build, part of you still hears a hum in the distance. Then came the first outage. It wasn't public at first. Lena messaged me again, this time with a screenshot of a Slack alert from their monitoring system. Service degradation across 3 regions. Failover initiated. Cache corruption suspected. I asked her how long it had been down. 6 minutes and counting. That may not sound like much, but in fintech, especially one promising real-time, anything, 6 minutes might as well be 6 hours. Clients panic. Traders hedge. Algorithms flail. 2 hours later, I read the headline on TechStream. Cretacore experiences partial downtime amid record user activity. The article quoted a spokesperson saying it was a minor performance hiccup. I knew better. Minor hiccups don't require 3 failover attempts. Minor hiccups don't corrupt cache layers built to withstand power outages. And minor hiccups don't require pulling a former architect out of bed at 3 a.m., as I soon found out. Because that's what happened. I got the email, short and sheepish. Then a follow-up call from someone on their board. Not Marlin. Not engineering leadership. Someone higher up, whose voice didn't ask. It surrendered. We understand you may have unique insight into some of the foundational infrastructure. We'd like to talk. I agreed to a short consult. On one condition, root access. No more guesswork. No more redacted dashboards. They complied. That alone told me everything. You don't give someone root unless you've exhausted every internal fix and you're out of time. Back inside their systems, I recognized my own architecture, battered, brittle, altered beyond intent. My failsafes weren't just disabled. They'd been patched over with brittle scripts, half-documented and completely misunderstood. A few services had been migrated off the grid entirely, onto a new event streaming platform I'd explicitly flagged as high risk for financial workloads. It wasn't sabotage, it was hubris. Speed at the expense of foresight. They moved fast, and they broke everything. It was a Friday. I remember because I was working from home, prepping a risk audit for a payments client in Oslo. My apartment was quiet, coffee still warm. Outside, the city was crawling into spring. Then my phone buzzed. 5 messages, all from different people. 2 former engineers, 1 product lead, Lena, and a partner from Perimeter Base who usually avoided sensationalism like the plague. All 5 messages said some version of the same thing. Cretacore is down. Not degraded. Not slow. Down. I clicked through the links they'd sent. First, a Reddit post titled, "Anyone else locked out of Cretacore?" with over 1,200 comments. Then a string of screenshots from someone who claimed to work Tier 1 support. One showed a terminal output with cascading 500 internal server error messages. Another showed a failed DNS propagation chain. Region after region had tripped. Nothing had recovered. Have you subscribed to our channel yet? Hit that subscribe button and the notification bell so you don't miss any of our upcoming videos. The Reddit thread was already spiraling. Rumors of a hack. Speculation of bankruptcy. Panic. But the most important clue came not from Reddit, but from an anonymous tweet. Confirmed, DR protocol was never triggered. Failovers weren't just broken, they were bypassed. This wasn't an attack. It was config drift. I stared at that sentence for a long time. Config drift. It's a quiet kind of failure. No alarms. No fireworks. Just small, slow changes that move your infrastructure out of sync with its intended state. Over time, What's deployed diverges from what's documented. The system you think you're running isn't the system that's actually live. That's why I designed the DR protocol to be immutable. Immutable infrastructure isn't trendy because it's rigid, but rigidity has its place, especially when failure must be binary, not optional. But if you override it, well, you get what was happening now. Krita Core wasn't hacked. It collapsed under the weight of its own ungoverned velocity. As I dug deeper, I started seeing screenshots from Twitter. Not official ones. Leaks. Screens snapped from internal Slack threads, terminal windows, and Jenkins logs. Blurred usernames, but not blurred panic. One Slack message read, "We tried to roll back the deployment, but the new config was already replicated globally." Another said, "DNS failover initiated, but the routing table doesn't recognize the backup zones. Did someone delete the US West shadow nodes?" And one, raw and resigned, "No one can SSH into the core clusters. All root keys are invalid. DR is unreachable." The public didn't need to see those to know something was deeply wrong. By noon, every major fintech blog had picked it up. Krita Core users locked out, companies silent, funds frozen, access denied. Krita Core faces unprecedented outage. They were right to call it unprecedented. By late Friday evening, it had been 10 hours of silence. No public update, no functional site, not even a holding page. Just a rotating loading wheel and an error. Service temporarily unavailable. Please try again later. But the real message was buried deeper. In the infrastructure logs I still had access to. The read-only now. An artifact of my brief consulting session post-failure. I refreshed my access token. Still valid. So I looked. The deployment that triggered the collapse had pushed changes across all environments at once. Dev, staging, and production. No segmentation. No rollback buffer. A single push triggered a reconfiguration of their container orchestration system. And with that, the fault lines opened. The system tried to reconcile the new configuration with what it believed was running. But what it believed was wrong. Shadow clusters had been removed. DNS records hadn't updated. Auto-scaling groups attempted to deploy into zones that no longer existed. The disaster recovery protocol should have stopped all of this. That's what it was built for. Immutable failovers. Hard-coded regions. Self-healing watchdogs. Except it wasn't there anymore. Someone had commented it out. Literally. Lines of code prefixed with hashtag disabled underscore testing. No notes. No explanation. Just deleted redundancy in the name of velocity. And now, 36 hours in, they couldn't even rebuild what they'd lost. Because the system they'd broken was the one that also held the keys to rebuilding. You don't get to move fast when your blueprint has been shredded and the scaffolding collapsed. Saturday came and went. Still down. No public statements. Only scattered reports that Krita Core's leadership had locked themselves in war rooms, combing backups, trying to reverse engineer a recovery. But that's the problem with over-optimization. When it works, no one sees the cost. When it fails, no one remembers how it worked in the first place. By Sunday morning, one of the largest Reddit threads in fintech history had emerged. Thousands of users, screenshots, theories, rage. Some clients claimed they were locked out of accounts with six-figure balances. Others posted videos showing mobile apps stuck in infinite loops. And some simply asked, "Is this money gone?" It wasn't. Yet. But it was stranded. In a system without map or compass. Krita Core hadn't just gone down. It had vanished. Monday morning arrived with the kind of quiet I had come to expect at Perimeter Base. A solid start to the week, though I knew the storm on the other side of the industry was far from over. My phone buzzed. Twice. The first was a number I didn't recognize. The name on the caller ID was Recruiter Global Talent. I hesitated. They were usually persistent, but never particularly important. I let it ring once more before hitting ignore. The second buzz was quicker, more urgent. The caller ID read Krita Core Board VP. I'd worked with this person in the past. Always cordial but distant. She had been in operations, not engineering. But this time, the urgency in her name felt different. I let it ring 3 more times. The phone stopped. Then a voicemail. I didn't need to listen to it. The tone alone told me everything I needed to know. She was reaching out because there was no one else to turn to. After a moment of quiet deliberation, I dialed back. The line picked up quickly. Her voice was clipped, professional, but underlined with something else. Desperation. "Ronald, thank you for calling back. I'm glad you did." She was speaking in the cadence of someone who'd rehearsed the script but hadn't yet figured out how to sell it. I stayed silent. She continued, explaining the situation. What I'd already read, already knew. The fallout from the previous weekend's system failure. The press coverage. The internal panic. How several key engineers had quit mid-crisis, citing irreparable damage to trust and leadership. I didn't need her to list the details. I'd seen it unfold. I'd been in their systems just hours earlier, reading the logs. It wasn't the first time a company had eaten itself from the inside out during a meltdown. They weren't unique, but they were getting desperate. "You're aware of the situation, I'm sure," she said. "What we need, what I'm asking, is for you to come in and consult. At a premium rate, of course. We need someone who can stabilize the system, get it back online, fix what's broken. Have you subscribed to our channel yet? Hit that subscribe button and the notification bell so you don't miss any of our upcoming videos." The silence hung longer than it should have. "I'm listening," I said. The words tumbled out in a practiced manner, but I could tell she was trying to maintain control. "We need a comprehensive audit of the infrastructure. Restore some faith with our clients. We'll need you to work directly with the CTO's office." She hesitated. "You'll be working with Marlon's team, of course. He's unavailable right now, currently unreachable." In fact, that wasn't a surprise. It was one of those leadership decisions that could have been either strategic or self-preserving, depending on how it played out. "I'm assuming this would be under the table, so to speak?" I asked, my tone flat. "Of course. We'll handle all the logistics and terms privately. You be working in a consultative role. No long-term commitment. Just results." I took a long breath. They needed me to help fix a mess they'd created. To apply a quick patch. That was clear. But I wasn't in the business of applying temporary fixes. "I'll agree to help," I said, "on one condition." She paused. "I don't fix symptoms. I rebuild foundations." I could almost hear the weight of the silence as she processed the words. Her response came quickly. "We're desperate, Ronald. We'll do whatever it takes. We need your expertise." She was already accepting what I was saying, and I could tell she knew this wasn't going to be a quick fix. "You're aware of the scope of the problem, then?" I asked. "Yes, absolutely. We know the DR protocols you implemented aren't just down, they've been overridden. That's part of why this has gone so badly." I didn't say anything. She was getting to the heart of it. She was acknowledging the elephant in the room. Marlon's team had compromised the very foundations I'd built, and now they needed me to clean up their mess. I wasn't interested in cosmetic solutions. "You'll need to bring in an entirely new deployment strategy," I continued, my voice even. "You'll have to restore trust across the team and establish a new standard. Rebuild the infrastructure from the ground up, not just patch what's visible." "Understood," she replied. I could hear the exhaustion in her voice now. There was no bravado left, just the cold reality of a company on the brink. I asked one more question before we finalized the details. "Who's in charge while Marlon's unreachable?" There was a slight hesitation, then a soft response. "Right now, no one. And that's part of the issue." Of course there wasn't. The foundation was already cracked. We talked through the specifics. I agreed to a consultancy fee that reflected the gravity of the work ahead. There'd be no quick fixes. Not for me. "Good," I said. "I'll need full access to your infrastructure. Root-level permissions. Direct access to all documentation, code repositories, and deployment pipelines. No excuses." There was a pause, but then she agreed. "Thank you, Ronald," she said. "We'll send over the contracts. We'll be waiting." I hung up. The work was already starting in my mind. The pieces were already fitting together. But I wasn't interested in starting where they wanted me to start. They wanted me to consult. Fine. But first, I needed to see the damage. The scale of it. The systemic failure they had created. And when I found it, I would rebuild it. From the ground up. I returned to Creta Core on Tuesday morning. The office was quieter than I remembered. Hollow, almost as if the walls had absorbed the panic and resignation that had permeated the air the last few days. I walked through the lobby, passing by a few engineers hunched over their screens, some of them glancing up briefly before returning to their work. There was a subtle but unmistakable fear in the air, the kind that settles in when something once reliable collapses, the kind that makes everyone doubt everything that's come before. I didn't need to say anything. The atmosphere said it all. The board's meeting room was on the top floor. I walked in, my shoes quiet on the polished floor. No one spoke. The chairs were arranged like an interrogation, each one facing the table, where the executives sat, waiting for me to begin. I didn't waste time. I pulled out my laptop, opened the logs, and placed the screen in front of them. "Here," I said, pointing to the terminal output that had been captured just before the system went down. The line stood out like a scar on an otherwise pristine log. Hashtag rollback_trigger_disabled. Reason: optimization for speed. I stared at the line for a moment before looking up. "This," I said flatly, "is where the rollback trigger was deleted. The protocol that would have saved you. The one that would have saved your users, your clients, your data." The room was silent. A few board members shifted uncomfortably, avoiding my gaze. Marlon walked in just then, several minutes late. His eyes were down, avoiding mine, as if the weight of the room had already told him everything he needed to know. He didn't make eye contact. He took his seat at the far end of the table and opened his laptop, fingers hovering over the keys but not typing anything. I wasn't interested in making small talk or waiting for his explanation. There was no point in revisiting what everyone already knew. I turned to the board. This was avoidable. I documented the risks 6 quarters ago. I said, my voice even, steady. I'd put it in the report. A clear, concise risk assessment outlining the dangers of pushing through rapid deployments without a sufficient rollback safety net. A risk assessment that had been brushed aside in favor of speed, ignored for the sake of growth. And now, here we were. We have the documentation. I submitted it when I left. You knew about the risk. And now, here we are. The board didn't respond right away. There was no defense, just the quiet hum of air conditioning and the sound of fingers tapping keys as they reviewed the old reports. One of the board members, the CFO, cleared his throat. "Ronald," he said, his voice tight, "we need a plan. We need a recovery protocol. Now." I nodded. It wasn't a request. It was an expectation. They wanted something that could be presented, a way to show the world that Credicore was back on track. I could see the urgency in their eyes. They needed a win, and they needed it fast. "Fine," I said, "but I don't work alone." There was a pause before anyone said anything. I saw their expressions shift, just a hint of discomfort at the idea, but they knew better than to argue. "I'll bring in my team from Perimeter Base," I continued. "We'll work together to rebuild. This time, we'll do it right." I didn't wait for their approval. I wasn't asking for it. I was telling them what needed to be done. The board exchanged looks. They understood the gravity of what I was saying, and they didn't argue. They knew that without me, and without the right team, the company wouldn't make it through this crisis. "We'll send over the necessary permissions for your team," the board chair said, finally breaking the silence. "What do you need from us, Ronald?" "Access to everything," I said. "Code repositories, documentation, deployment pipelines, and full oversight of all recovery operations. No more cutting corners." The CFO nodded slowly, eyes narrowed. "Understood. We'll arrange it." With that, the meeting was adjourned. The board members filtered out, each one avoiding eye contact as they left the room, the weight of the failures still hanging heavily in the air. Marlon lingered, silent. I didn't acknowledge him. There was nothing to say that hadn't already been said. I closed my laptop and stood up, moving towards the door. As I walked out, I could hear him speaking to the board in low tones, offering a defense that no one was listening to. His voice lacked conviction. The room had already made its decision. Outside, I called the team at Perimeter Base, ready to start the rebuild. No gloating, no finger pointing, just logs. And when it was all done, the system would be stronger. But this time, I would be the one leading it. It wasn't long before the story hit Bloomberg Tech. Credocor's collapse, how speed cost them trust, made the rounds, dissecting the company's downfall with a precision that mirrored the incident itself. They covered everything: the rushed product launches, the overhyped growth, and, of course, the missing rollback trigger. But the part that resonated the most was the truth about the firm's once stellar reputation, which had been built on the trust of its clients, now in tatters. Marlon Riggs resigned quietly a week after the story broke. There were no grand announcements, no press releases, just a low-key exit, as if the weight of the failure had finally caught up with him. The company quietly spun off several assets, including a few of their core product lines, but nothing could erase the damage done to their credibility. I wasn't surprised. The board reached out to me several times, trying to convince me to stay on as a permanent consultant. They offered more money, a seat at the table. They even mentioned reshaping the company's future with me as a key part of it. But I declined. I had seen it all before. They wanted the solution, but they didn't want the discipline it took to maintain it. The lessons were too expensive for them to learn quickly enough, and I wasn't about to stick around for another crash course in rebuilding trust. I went back to Perimeter Base, where several of the engineers from Credocor followed. Not long after, some of Credocor's clients reached out too. They'd had enough of the drama, and they wanted stability. I didn't promise them a perfect system. I promised them something better. A system that didn't rely on shortcuts or false promises, and a partner who would always choose sustainability over speed. The offers kept coming, and I kept building, not just technology, but trust. Months later, I found myself at a conference in San Francisco, speaking on a panel about cybersecurity and system resiliency. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest work. The topic was simple, and the room was full of eager faces looking for something actionable. I spoke about what went wrong at Credocor and how every disaster, no matter how technical, came down to one thing: reliability. The title of my presentation was "Resiliency Isn't Expensive, Recovery Is." It was a reminder that cutting corners may make things move faster, but it's the recovery process that ends up costing more in the long run. The session was well received. I didn't go overboard with the details of the Credocor situation. There was no need to gloat, but I could tell some of the audience had read the news. A few eyes lingered on me a bit longer than usual, but it didn't matter. I wasn't there to be a part of their drama. I was there to teach. At the end of the conference, I left my slide deck on a table by the exit. I figured someone would pick it up, review the notes, and forget about it by the time they were boarding their flight home. But as I turned to leave, I heard a voice behind me. He's the one who built Credocor's backbone. Before they ripped it out, I didn't turn around. I didn't need to. The truth had already left the room. Here are some questions for you, our viewers. Do you think speed or resiliency is more important in building a tech company? Why? Have you ever had to clean up someone else's mistake in your career? How did you handle it? What lessons can businesses learn from rushing their product launches without focusing on long-term reliability? Share your thoughts with us in the comments section. Hit the like button, subscribe to our channel, and turn on the notification bell because we have more stories coming up just for you.